Hello everybody and welcome to another session of this Neptune DXP SAP Edition Expert e-learning. Today we will see how to use APIs in applications inside the SAP Edition. After today's sessions, you will learn how to structure an ABAP class for an API, how to create an API in API Designer after the class has been created, how to call an API within an app, how data binding works within the API context, and in general, how to use APIs in the app designer. So let's get started. So let's start creating an API. And everything starts in the SAP side, especially in the transaction SC24, the one we use to create classes, and we will create one class. I already created this one. And the first thing that we will do in order to create an API or to transform a class into an API is to add the following interface: /Neptune/if_REST API. Once you add this interface into a class, automatically it will be enabling the API designer to transform this class into an API. It's important to know certain rules when designing a class for an API. The first rule, as we just saw, adding this interface into the class. Second rule, you will be creating the methods, one for each operation of your API. And the visibility for these methods have to be public. You won't be able to create an operation for a private method. Another rule is that all the importing parameters that a method may have can be importing parameters for the operation. But it's important to remember that this parameter cannot be complex set of data. So it cannot be a table or cannot be a structure. They have to be single variables, single values. Also, another important rule is that you cannot have exporting parameters. They will be ignored when the API is going to be developed. So in order to manage data that is complex, either a table or a structure, importing into the class or exporting out of the class to the API, we will use attributes. Just in the same way we normally do with AJAX calls. Okay, so we will develop and we will create a set of attributes which are either tables or structures, and they have to be defined as public. And these ones can be used inside the methods either as importing data or to be sending back data from the backend to the front end through an API. With these considerations, you can start developing your class. Let me explain very briefly this class that I just created, just to stay in context. So I created my class, I added my interface, and this class have three methods. Two of them are public. The first method is getMaterial. GetMaterial, practically, the first thing he do is to call the private method to get the default values from the user. Then he will do different selects and sorting and retrieve a list of materials that they will be put in a public attribute, which is called IT material, which is a list of materials. Same is safe counting. Okay, but this is retrieving. Again, the first thing he do is to call the method to get the default values parameters from the user. First thing after that is check that these public attributes is not empty. Okay, so it's supposed to be with data coming from the front end. And then elaborate the data just to save the inventory counting. So as you can see, it's a very simple class if we need to compare to the Ajax way of creating a backend connection, the difference is that it's a different interface, and this interface won't create any other methods. Specifically, there is not the onAjax method where you need to maintain the different type of Ajax ID. That concept doesn't exist in the API concept. It's a direct mapping, one method per operation of an API, and each of these methods has to be public. So once we have developed the class for our API, we can go to our cockpit of the SAP Edition and search for a tool called API Designer. This is where we will be creating the API based on the class. So first thing we do is to go to Add New API. We give it a name. We give it a path, which will be part of the endpoint pointing to this API. And here's asking me to provide a class, which must have this interface already there. So I'm going to search for my class and click on Create API. And let's go one by one to this object. So the first general page that I will see, it's talking about my API. So it's the name, the path, and the class. If we need to pack these into a CR, then we need to provide here the package name, description, and version. Okay, obviously this is optional. Also, if you're running these in a different RFC destination or with a specific ICF subnode, you need to put them here. And there are different other options if you want to disable temporarily this API, or if you want to trace all operations, so that is in the log of the SAP Edition all the time, etc. Normally these ones, you will only set them up in case that you need. The other point is contact. Obviously here is just general information about you as a developer. In about is where you're supposed to write your documentation about this API, how it works, what it does. Policies, just as any other object in Neptune, is where you can assign roles or policies or people to this API. So when you add a policy here, only the users that are inside that policy will be able to launch or to use this API. Data provider class, so you will have the ABAP class, all the code. So in case that you need to verify some coding or to understand what it does. Next tab is where used. Just as the name says, here will appear the list of all the Neptune objects that are calling or using this API. Just because this is very, very new, no other objects are using it at the moment. But if you were to use this API in an app, then the name of the application will appear here. Another important point is Swagger UI, and this is integrated within Neptune, so you will be able to have the Swagger and to test the APIs directly from the Swagger integrated here. You can either choose OpenAPI 3.0 or version number 2.0. Of course, here it says no API definition provided because we haven't created yet any operation for the API. We're still in design mode. But once the application is going to be fully completed, then you'll be able to see the whole Swagger for this API. And last but not least, transports. So here you will keep track of all the versioning, all the CRs, that contains your API. So all the changes in your API, you will be able to see them here. Once we created, let's say, the header of the API, next step would be to add operations. Here we need to work very closely to our class to understand which methods needs to be added as operations and to understand which data are you planning to send or receive from this API. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is to go to operations, create a new one, give a path. For example, we want to create a first operation to match my get material method. So I will call it get underscore materials. Next thing he will ask me is which method HTTP I want to use. And there are several options here, depending on what are you supposed to do with this operation. In this case, I'm just doing a get materials. I'm not doing any writing or any deleting or adding any new data into SAP. I'm just reading from SAP. So in my case, it will be a get. Next step is to assign one of the public methods in my class to my operation. So you can see it's listing already the two public methods that I have in my class. And in this case, I want to assign it to get material. Let's put our attention to these two tabs here, request and response. In request, we will find all the data that is supposed to receive the backend when the class is going to be called through these APIs. So when the application is doing a request through this API, which data are you sending? Automatically, all the importing parameters will appear here, okay? So you don't need to worry about those. In my case, my example doesn't have any importing parameter. And just because this is a get method, I won't be able either to send any public attributes to this method. And in response, we are going to be choosing from the list of public attributes of my class which ones I'm sending back from the backend with data to the front end. Okay, in my case, I know that this method is feeding data into IT material. So I will choose these to be received. You may have data in more than one public attribute called from one single method. And then in that case, you need to choose all those attributes that you are receiving data from. Our first operation is done. Now we need to create the second operation. And the second operation will be used to save data into the backend. So save counting, I'll call it. And in this case, I am not doing a get because I'm going to be writing new data into my backend. And in this case, I will be using a post. And I'm assigning a new method, which will be the save counting method from my class. Now I want you to notice something. If I go to request, in the parameter list, I don't have any parameters. And this is because also this method doesn't have any importing parameters on it. In my body of my request, I could choose to send any of these bindings, which are bound to the attributes of my class. So we need to verify in the ABAP class what this method is supposed to be receiving data. And in my case, I can actually see that is checking IT outbox is not initial. So he will elaborate data that is being sent through this attribute. So IT outbox, I'm going to mark it as send. Same wise for the response. All the list of bound attributes, I just need to verify in my ABAP class what I'm supposed to be sending back. And I think I'm just sending back the same object. Once we have done this, so we can click on save and we can consider our API done. Now we'll continue our exercise in our app designer. Okay, we will create an application that will call APIs to communicate with the backend. So first thing that you will notice is an application that is using APIs don't require to have an application class bound to it. You could still do it if you want to mix and match AJAX calls with APIs, but if you're going to be using only APIs, it's not necessary to bind any application class to the application at all. For this exercise, I will be reusing the inventory application from the eLearning. Okay, so I will have a master list that will contain the list of materials coming from the backend. Then when the user selects one item from this list, will be navigated to a page details. Well, they will be inputting the counted value. that counted value will go into an outbox page. And then with a button to synchronize the data, all that data will be sent to the backend via an API. So in reality, we will be using only two APIs. One for retrieving the master list and one to send the data back to SAP with the outbox list. So let's get started. First thing that we're going to do after we have all our UI elements created in the application is to search for an object called API, and I will drag it to the resources. For the first API, I will change the name and I will put get material. I will find the API from the list, or I will just write it here, and automatically he will ask me which operation I want to bind to this API. In my case, I want to use the get materials. Now, when we do this, we are telling the application that there is an API and specifically an operation that is going to be used in the application at all. All the objects may have access to the bound objects of this API. After we do the first definition of the API, we go back to the object that is supposed to have data either coming into the API or coming back from the API. So I will grab my master list, which contains a list of materials, and I will do a binding. And as you can see here in the binding, it already tells me all the attributes that are available for me coming from the API. So in this case, I want to choose from the binding of my API, the table IT material. Now, coming back to my API, the only thing that I need to do now is to check what I need to send or what I need to receive when this API is called. In my case, I don't need to send anything. I just need to receive the binding IT material and put it into my master list. Here, you notice as well that you have some events that you normally have as well in the Ajax code. Okay, so first is a set init load. In this case, you can leave it online if you want it always to be online, or empty if you want to call it on demand. So using the command get online, REST API, get material. In my case, I will do it online. So let's activate and test at least the first part. So when we run it, I will notice that my list of materials is being called and retrieved here. Also, we have an Ajax error and an Ajax success as events of the API, and we need to maintain these ones because this is the object that is making the call. It's not the master list, which also have an Ajax error and Ajax success. So what we need to do is just to copy, remove it from here, and put it back to the object that is actually making the call. So let's save and activate, and let's test this. So as you can see, we have here the list of materials coming from the API. So now we continue with the exercise, and what we need to do is that when a user selects one of the lines, populates a second page, the detail page, with all the information for that selected line. And to do that, we need to bind page detail with a structure of the same type of the table, so the same material type. And it's important to know that when you add an API to an application, you have available throughout your application all the attributes bound to the class of that API. So you can use it to do the modeling, the binding. Okay, so in my case, I want then bind of page detail to WA material, which is a structure of IT material and is coming from the API. So when we save and activate this application, and I click on one of my material items, I can see that it's populating correctly the second page. Now, next step would be to add the second API, and specifically we need to bind the outbox table to a structure from that API. So let's grab our outbox list, and first thing that we will do is bind it to IT outbox. And also take another API, give it a name, assign it to my API, and to another operation, which will be our save counting post. And here is where we're going to do the definition of what I'm going to send and what I'm going to. And I know that in my case, this operation of the API wants to send and receive the same object. So let's activate and test it. Material has been counted. I can see my item here in the outbox list. The only thing that we need to do now is to trigger the call to that API. Okay, that will happen when I click on my button here. It's very simple because you don't need to learn anything new. It will be exactly the same command that you used to use for Ajax calls. So let's locate our button. In the press event of the button, it says, here goes a get online. So what I'm gonna be calling is the following command, get online, and then the name of my API. And that's it. We just need to make sure that for this API, I'm maintaining the Ajax error and the Ajax success the same way that I used to have it here before. So I'm gonna remove it from here and put it here. Now let's go to our application. We can see the list of materials coming in. We have one material here in the list, but let's use another one. Let's count it. Let's add it to the list. We have 2 elements on the list, and when I click on my button, the list disappears because it's calling the API. In the developer tools, it will look very similar to what we used to see as Ajax calls in the network. So let's call, for example, one of these materials. And when I click on synchronize, I can see here my API being called, which is called save counting. Okay, and it have a URL, which is type post. And in the payload, I can see what I'm sending and I can see what I'm receiving, which is IT outbox empty. In terms of developing an offline application, but using APIs instead of Ajax calls, is exactly the same. Because remember, the offline capabilities belongs to the UI5 element. The master list, for example, when we verify all the model attributes attached to it, it's safe offline. So we have the same capabilities and we decide if we want to do set enable cache to true, and we choose a cache type and how we want to save it. Imagine we have another method which is public in my class, and this method will retrieve the material details and we need to pass a material numbers. It means that this method will have an importing parameter called MayTNF. We need to add that method to our API as an operation. So I choose a new one, give a path, and I give a method. In this case, it will be a get, and I will choose my method. Now, automatically, if I go to request, I will notice that material number is going to be there as an importing parameter. And as a response, I just need to choose what I want to receive. In this case, work area material. In the app designer, I just need to add the API into my list of resources. I won't send any of these elements because I will only send a variable, which is the importing parameter, but I want to receive in page detail this element. Set init load will be empty, so I will call it on demand, and I will be calling it at the press event of the item press of my list. And at the press event of my list, after retrieving the data from the selected list item, I will call my API via coding. So we know already that get online and then the name of my API will do the trick. But we need to pass a parameter, and this parameter is passed through a variable. So we will create a variable called options. We will pass it here. And then we will need to feed this options variable with the material number, but it has to have a specific structure. And I will show you very easily to understand how. If you notice in the request, material number is inside a list of parameters. So this means options will be a JSON which contains a node called parameters, which at the same time contain a property called material number that we will then map it to the value coming from my list. And then this is the variable we will be passing to the getOnline. So let's make a quick recap of what we learned today. So from the backend side, to create an API, remember that each API will have an ABAP class associated. This class must have the Neptune if REST API interface. Each public method can be an operation of an API. And also, all public attributes can be used in APIs to send or receive data. The usage of APIs in the app designer, remember that you don't need to associate an app to a class. Once you add an API to the app, all the attributes of the class of that API are available to be bound with the UI elements of the app. All the APIs can be triggered automatically with the setInitLoad property set as online, or be called on demand with the JS code getOnline. And if you are using importing parameters in an API operation, they must be sent via JS code in a variable called options. And the way that you normally code this is as it is here. So a variable, which is a JSON, which has a node called parameters. This node then will have all the importing parameters by name and then map to the values. And then you send these variable options to the getOnline. And this is how we conclude another session from this expert SAP edition learning. Thank you and happy learning. See you next time.